All right. So good morning, everybody. Before I get too far down this road, I just want to do a quick survey. How many of you in here own or have flown a drone before? Just raise your hand. Okay, that's quite a few. Fantastic. And one more. How many of you have come across a drone either in a case or in some sort of investigation that you were working? Not so many. All right. Couple though. Well, throughout the next 30 minutes, we'll try to get through as much of this as we can, and hopefully everybody will take something new away about what we can do with drones. Just a little bit about me. We won't spend too much time on this slide, but I come from a Defense Department background. As Phil mentioned, this conflict in Russia and Ukraine right now is very much a drone war. So it's been very interesting to kind of watch what's been going on. I started at the Defense Innovation Unit, a small team called Rogue Squadron. We literally worked in a cage, actually a cage. We had no AC, we had no heat. Thankfully, we were in California, but we loved it. So we were the garage nerds, if you will, of the Defense Department for a while. So with that, maybe the title should have been more Rise of the Machines instead of Rise of the Drones, right? If you've watched this conflict a little bit more closely, drones are everywhere, but so are surface vehicles. There's ships being blown up in the Black Sea with very cheap Starlink-controlled boats. Ground robots are destroying Abrams tanks everywhere. There's a lot of interesting things going on with respect to these types of devices, but we're here to talk about what these things collect, what sort of data is available on them, and how we can use that either in a domestic law enforcement capacity or whether it's corporate or, of course, wartime. Here's just a couple examples of why it matters a little bit. Most of these are very recent. The top one is essentially, you're walking back from work, you work in a prison, and you trip over this white thing on the ground. What was this doing? Why is this here? It's probably got some drugs strapped to it. You can't see them in the photo, but what were they doing with this around the prison? A second one, this happened in January of this year. If anybody is a football fan and was watching the AFC Championship, you'll notice that there was about a 5-minute random delay where the game just stopped. Nobody was saying anything, and then security came up and told the announcers that there was a drone. This happens all the time. I think the NFL testified like 900 or so instances over the past few years of just intrusions at NFL games, and that's just one example. You've got basketball, anything outdoors, hockey has outdoor games, etc. And finally, just about a month ago, a little bit over a month ago, there was a drone used in a relatively well-known assassination attempt. The forensics of that aircraft is going to be central to what comes of that investigation. Although nothing has been released on what they have found on the aircraft yet, other than that they have not found any photos and no video. It will be interesting to see what sort of role that ends up playing as that starts to bubble out into the public. So with that in mind, for anyone that's not familiar with a drone, this is a very simple, dumb diagram of essentially what a drone is. You've got the aircraft, of course. You've got a controller, and sometimes there's a mobile phone involved too. You'll note the controller that I have up here on the screen, it's got a phone built into it. It's called a smart controller. They're not all that way. Sometimes you don't need a phone if you're not looking at video. If you don't need to see what the drone's looking at, you don't need a phone for that. Sometimes there's FPV goggles involved so you can see first person what's going on. Also, this is very general. The most important thing I wanted to point out on this, though, is there is remote ID. A lot of these drones are broadcasting data that might be collected and stored somewhere else. So just because you have recovered an aircraft doesn't mean that a forensic investigation stops at the physical device. There could be sensors in the vicinity of where it flew that may have collected data or information from it. A little bit more detailed, what is on a drone? This is just a big list, and I won't read it because I have a nice diagram here. The brains of a drone are the flight controller. It's making autonomous decisions. It's figuring out how to fly, where should I fly, how do I avoid that thing, make sure I don't hit the tree, I don't want to crash, I need to land, etc. So it receives inputs from a litany of different sensors. You can see a couple of them on the screen. Some of them are the ones that you would expect, a GPS. A lot of the higher end drones today have things like optical flow or other vision cameras going on. Those things take pictures. Those pictures get stored. And when all of that stuff is extracted from the drone, just because the pilot didn't say, take a photo or don't record any video at this point in time, does not mean the drone didn't decide to do it for them. And there's a lot of other things on here as well. Another one I'd call out that may be forgotten is ADS-B. So if anyone's familiar with manned aviation, ADS-B is a very interesting external source of information. If somebody's tampered with an aircraft and deleted its GPS data some way or another, and we'll get to that in the next few slides, ADS-B could help us at least triangulate a general region, especially if we see 4 or 5 aircraft. There's only really 1 or 2 times in the world when 5 numbered aircraft are going to be in the same vicinity. All that data is on flight radar and other things like that. So with that, if you're investigating a drone, like what questions would you ask yourself? What are the things that are important to know? Some of them are really obvious. This just kind of gives you a quick overview of what those are. Of course, where did it fly? History is important too, though. Who here would go out and buy a drone, buy some fancy drop mechanism for $25 off of Amazon, and in the very first flight you've ever flown, take it to a prison and try to drop contraband? I don't think anyone's going to do that. Usually, it's in their backyard. So if you can find the history of where it flew, oftentimes you can find a home, you can find a pilot. We're not really going to be solving a case with a drone completely, but we'll find ourselves somebody else. Of course, what was the pilot trying to do? If there's a drop mechanism involved, that's a pretty good indicator of what was going on. If there's not, are they trying to just do some intelligence and surveillance? If anyone was reading the news this morning, there was a NATO base in Germany that's having a drone issue right now. It's a nuclear facility that they believe has come under surveillance from some foreign state actor. Again, forensics will, if they manage to recover an aircraft, will play a significant role in what they try to determine happened. This is just designed so that you really can't, you can kind of fathom the scale of how many different manufacturers and components there are. Some people build their own drones. I think there's some people I've spoken to in the audience that have played around with wiring up their own aircraft. It's going to have a completely different forensic footprint than the commercial off-the-shelf stuff you buy at Best Buy. So this is just to kind of show the scale of the market. And this is as of 2022. And then one more, the good news here, DJI in 2021 was very much the primary company that manufactures aircraft. They still are to this day. There's just not a lot of good research on it. There's other brands out there like Skydio, Parrot, Autel, and so on. All of those different ones have some similarities to DJI. But with that in mind, we'll start the technical discussion here a little bit. And I'm going to be focusing on a Mavic Air 3. So for anyone that's never seen that aircraft before and wants to see what it looks like, I do have one with me. So if you find me at some point today, I can show you it. I also have the drop mechanism I used to generate all the logs we're going to look at here with me. So you can get a chance to just take a look at how simple these things really are. They truly are $25 on Amazon. So I also had an RC2 smart controller and the DJI Fly app. I didn't really focus a lot on, for this presentation, the information that you're going to find on the smart controller or on the apps. Instead, I was looking at the aircraft. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But there are logs on all 3 of these devices, and they will all correlate with each other. So if you do manage to recover an aircraft, you find a pilot, the pilot tells you, hey, I didn't fly that. Well, your phone says otherwise, right? It's got a log on it that matches the one that's on the aircraft or very close. So with that in mind, how do we get logs off of the aircraft? It's probably one of the hardest parts of the entire process, right? Of course, DJI builds a tool for you to do this if you trust using it. They are a Chinese company, so if that's what you want to do, then fantastic, that'll help. It's going to be encrypted, though. The same thing with the other 3 options on the left there. A lot of the older drones have an onboard FTP server. You can log into it, download the logs. They're encrypted. The same thing with DUML. We'll talk about DUML on the next slide, but DUML is the DJI universal markup language. It's their internal communication protocol. All of the individual components on an aircraft are speaking to each other. If you want to talk to the battery, if you want to talk to the flight controller, if you want to talk to the camera, to the gimbal, all of those different components, they all speak the same language, and that's DUML. So of course, if you know how to structure the appropriate DUML command, you can extract files by asking for those. There's two versions. The newer platforms use USB directly. The older ones, they use serial over a USB cable. But with all that in mind, those are the primary ways you're going to get data off of a live device. There's always the option of taking advantage of some sort of exploit. They're out there. It's pretty limited. There's a lot of different firmwares. There's a lot of different models. It's hard to find an exploit that works on all of them. And finally, of course, you can chip off. You can do the hardware type. It's not easy to do that, of course, but there are labs and groups that are very good at doing stuff like that. So depending on the level of the investigation, you may want to take different approaches here. But oftentimes, especially if you're dealing with swarms, I think 900 to 1,000 drones are intercepted every month at the border between the United States and Mexico. There is no way they're going to do a chip off and forensics on every single one of those devices. It doesn't scale. But they can pull the logs off the other ways and at least get some sort of triage analysis of what's going on. So with that in mind, this is the DUML structure. It's pretty well documented. At the end of the slide deck, there's some links for open source tools and some documentation on what this looks like. The thing that's important to note here is there's two length fields, and it's 2 bytes total with the version number sort of embedded in it. And the reason that's interesting is because if I'm downloading a log file, it may be 300 megabytes. I have to download it like 900 bytes at a time, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So there's not a lot of tools out there that do this yet. There's a lot of other things that allow you to communicate with the aircraft. Some of the old day exploits would use this as ways to get access to some service that would then grant something we call security bug or a different level of access. A drone is based on Android, at least the DJI drones are based on Android. So there is ADB on them, but you have to be able to enable it in order to get a shell on the device. We talked about encryption a little bit. So before I go too far into encryption, I will say the 2 AES keys that are on the screen here, those are real. We found those on aircraft, on DJI aircraft. They are real. I stared at the word unknown probably for 4 hours, not thinking it was actually the key. You're telling yourself, I thought I was better at this. I've done all these other things and I found exploits before and I can't figure out where is it coming from? Why is it there? And then about 4 or 5 hours later, realized, wait a minute, maybe that is the key. And it was. But those are not used on the modern platforms anymore. Instead, there's a derivation process. Each platform has a platform key that's stored in hardware. A drone is very similar to a phone in this context. There's a trust zone, there's a crypto cell, there's trusted applications, there's secure memory, all of those things. All of that has to be bypassed in order to figure out what the encryption key is going to be for a specific platform. Log export keys are derived from the platform key, and they're usually the same across all the aircraft as well. I'm sorry, all the aircraft are the same model. Different models will have different log export keys and platform keys. And then each individual log is encrypted with a key specific to that one log file. And we'll talk about that here on the next few slides. So each log file, as you pull it off, has a header that looks like this. There's a lot of unknowns and unused in here because really there's data there, but it doesn't mean anything to the actual derivation process. The only things that matter are the encrypted data. There's a section in there starting with the model and ending with that random field that is used to derive that key. And so for those of you that enjoy matrix view a little bit better, this is a dump of what one of these headers looks like. This came off of a WA233. That's the model number for a Mavic Air 3. And the E1E that's the board. There's multiple boards on these aircraft in some cases, so sometimes you'll be pulling logs from different places. It just depends on the model. You'll also see a serial number in there. I'll note that serial number is not the serial number printed on the outside of the aircraft. That comes up later. But starting with that dark purple and working your way down to the end of the dark blue, that is the data, that is the material used to derive this key for this one log file. So we just take that section of data, encrypt it with the log export key, and the 16 bytes, the first 16 bytes that we get out, become the decryption key for the rest of the log file. There's a lot of work that goes into finding and getting these keys on every platform. Every single time DJI releases a drone, which is like 4 to 5 times a year, the keys change. And it takes trust zone level exploits to get access to these keys in the first place. So you probably won't find many of these floating around on the internet or in any sort of open source tools. But with that, I happen to have one for the Mavic Air 3. So once I decrypt the log file, this is what it looks like. Now we have real data. This has been the same for quite a few years. There's a bunch of tools out there that'll parse this file, but we'll talk in detail about the structure of this as well. The one thing I want to note here is there's a ton of U's on there. I'm sure some folks out here that have a good idea as to why. So DJI loves to obfuscate things, in some cases for reasons that aren't really known. So in this case, they just decided to XOR part of the header with the letter U. There is the serial number that is found on the body of my aircraft. Now, on older models, that's still not the case. The serials vary from platform to platform. The other thing you'll notice is if you look at the bottom in the black down there, there's another U, it's another 55. That's also the magic for each message in this log file. So essentially, there's a header to these log files, and then we append a message from different components until the aircraft turns itself off. So yeah, we'll get about 300 megabytes for a 45-minute flight in some cases. It's a lot of data. There's a lot of information in these log files. So here's a little bit more graphic view of the format of both the header as well as what the messages look like. And of course, the obfuscation didn't stop at just XORing with the letter U at the beginning. Every payload of every message is also XORed with the last byte of the tick number. So the tick number is just the time from boot up that that message was recorded. So you've got to XOR back out the payload to figure out what the real data is in there. And then we have the message type in here, which tells us what the format of that message is going to be. And we'll talk about a couple of those here in a moment. One interesting thing that DJI does is they have a self-defining process in these logs. So if you pull out all of the messages with the number 65533, you'll see something like this. Now you'll get a whole bunch more than this. This is just one example. But this is a definition of another type of message you would find in the log file. And it's telling us exactly what format it's in, how big each field is, and what the name of the field is as well. So in this case, type number 1200 is the control vertical module debug. Now, does this mean a lot to me forensically? Probably not. But there's a lot of other interesting things in here as well. Depending on what your goal is, the forensics of a drone doesn't have to be to catch a bad guy. If you're researching or helping a company that's developing a counter-UAS system, maybe they are trying to GPS jam an aircraft and they're not sure if they're being effective or not. You can pull out the HDOP and the PDOP and the different levels of dilution of precision from the GPS that the drone is recording in real time to see how effective different tools actually are. And then anti-forensics, there's a lot of this. So as things get more and more and more complicated, especially with more encryption, and as different wars heat up in different places, there's all sorts of things online to kind of help remove some of this data from the aircraft. This top photo is of a publicly available website. You can go to it right now. This is pretty hard to defend against. These boards are essentially taken off of the production line of DJI before they get inserted into the aircraft, and they're rooted. So you can just log in and change what you want. There's still secure boot going on. There's still a whole bunch of firmware level stuff happening, but these are available. You can also do the really simple things like this example here. This was from a few years ago with a Mavic 2, a little bit older platform. Tried to take out a Pennsylvania Power substation. They tied some nylon ropes and a thick copper wire to it. But when the aircraft was recovered, it was not successful in doing this, by the way. when it was recovered, they had tried to strip off all of the markings on the outside of the aircraft. They had ripped the camera off and pulled the SD cards out and all of that. The good thing about a Mavic 2 is it's got an internal eMMC. So all the flight logs are still on there, unless there was some other level of modification that was made that they did not release. So with that, we'll do a quick case study just to kind of show a little bit of the analysis of these aircraft. So everybody probably knows you can pull photos and videos off. We're not going to talk about that too much. Really, what I wanted to focus on in this section was how you can be a little bit more creative with the data that's available to you. There's a lot of data on these things, and you can use different things that you may not really think about at the beginning to support a conclusion. So in this case, we're going to be looking at, I called it Operation White Lightning. This is a fake case, but this is my aircraft here, and I found it crashed in a bush with this drop mechanism attached. You can see, like I said, I have the physical one here, but you can see this drop mechanism here. It just works with the downward light on the drone. So when you're flying these aircraft, usually the front two LEDs on the front two arms of the aircraft can be disabled in the app, so that when you're taking a photo, you're not getting that dilution from those lights. This aircraft also happens to have a downward light in case you need lighting for whether it's optical flow purposes or flying at night. So this one uses the downward light, which is also controllable in the app. And that's important because we're using DJI's own protocol for control of a payload drop. So this is just a photo sensor and a little servo. When it sees that light come on, it opens the servo. So this is what we're going to start with. We know nothing else about this drone. We're just going to try to see a few things that we can learn about it. Can we figure out who the pilot was? Can we figure out all those types of details? So one of the first things to look at, of course, is the identifiers, serial numbers, things like that. So one of the messages that you can pull out of these log files is called an event log. It's just a string. This is what part of it looks like. It'll usually be like maybe 1,000 or so lines for a flight. At the beginning, you'll see the FMU, the flight management unit here, is recording what its serial number is, as well as the battery serial number. So if we have potentially a organized crime type case, we might see batteries being swapped between different platforms. We might find a battery show up in San Diego that was used to fly an aircraft that was also found over in Florida. When that happens, that's a really big indicator of something more organized is going on. Not always the case though. For my Mavic 3, you can't use the Mavic 3 battery on any other type of platform. It's just a Mavic 3 battery, so it would have to be another Mavic 3. But with that said, we also have the firmware build time and versions in here. Some of the publicly available tools to bypass logs and to change settings on these aircraft will tweak this number. So if you see something like that, you can always compare the different bits and pieces you're seeing in the log file with what you would expect of that firmware and that model of aircraft. But it does get very specific to the firmware version of the aircraft as well as the model. This is another interesting one. Apparently takeoff is a word, but every time an aircraft takes off, it records its home point at that point in time. And you can see that happening right there in the middle. That's the latitude and longitude of when I took this aircraft off. And I also have the exact altitude that it was measuring at that point in time, which it tweaked down to 0, and that became its home point. If the battery dies, if it loses an RC comms and it's configured as such, it'll return back to that home point. It's also just a good indicator of what somebody's trying to achieve. In a lot of cases, the pilot, you can see the pilot location right below that. The app time, that's the time that the pilot was at that location, and the latitude and longitude of where the pilot is standing. So you are receiving 3 different locations for the aircraft itself as it flies its flight path, the home point from where it took off at, and the app time. Depending on what you're investigating, the home points can be changed in flight. And that's a common technique to avoid certain jammers or certain types of drone defense mechanisms. If the drone's configured to return to home point, when you turn on a jammer, it's going to return to the home point. So if you set the home point to where you wanted it to go in the first place, when you jam it, you're going to send it to where it was supposed to go. Just a few things to look for, but that's not always the case. And then finally, this one's an interesting one, the UUID. So this is unique to a login on DJI's servers. So the UUID is something that can be pulled out and used to identify whether or not the same pilot flew multiple aircraft. Now, without asking DJI, we probably won't be able to take this number. Well, I know who this one is. This is me, right? But we probably won't be able to figure out who that was without subpoenaing for some sort of information. But it still can be a correlator or a connection point. So the next one for the payload, this is where we're going to dive into some different data. So I had about a 600-gram payload attached to the bottom of this aircraft when I flew it. And you can imagine the impact that adding additional weight to a drone has. So one thing we have, it's going to change my slide for me, are currents. So this is the amperage draw of each motor. There's 4 motors on these aircraft. This is the amperage draw of each motor on the aircraft. And what we're looking for here are patterns that are inconsistent with what an aircraft would be doing while it's flying. A lot of the DJIs will automatically brake. So you'll see some engines are spiking or some of the ESCs are spiking and other ones are not. But there's really only one point in this entire graph that it just looks like the aircraft got lighter. And that is right there. So now I know exactly what time a payload was dropped. And if I take that and I plot my flight path and I put that time on the map, now I know where that payload was dropped at. Why is that important? If I'm using this to deliver contraband to a secret location or to some place that I'm trying not to walk to, or into a prison, for an example, knowing exactly where the payload went is really important to being able to figure out who it was destined for. In the case of this Operation White Lightning thing, it's about delivering different types of contraband to remote, whether it's moonshine stills or methamphetamine labs, delivering supplies for those. You know, we all know that pseudoephedrine is a pretty common over-the-counter drug that's used in these type of labs. And in Pennsylvania, we have all sorts of these in the woods every once in a while. Drones are a really good way to transport things without having to walk them and without having, you know, you really don't have the same level of risk that you're taking if you're trying to deliver, whether it's a cell phone into a prison or drugs or whatever it is, or across the border, which is where this happens quite frequently. So this is just an example of some creativity you can use in the data, and that's just one. But there's a lot of data in these logs. And finally, one last bit here is flight controller parameter. So the flight controller is configured via a big giant table that looks something like this. This is just one small portion of a table, but every input and decision that the aircraft is making is following along with some of the values that are located in this table. Of course, we can pull these tables out of these logs as well. So there's a couple examples on here of what the battery levels are. There's a few, you see good HDOP, super HDOP, fixed HDOP, weak HDOP, some GPS related stuff. If somebody has tweaked an aircraft to act a little bit differently than what it should, you'll see that show up in these tables as well. And a lot of the settings that you can tweak on the phone, if you're flying these aircraft, for those of you that have flown, you know there's that little hamburger menu with about 1,000 different options in there. If you're changing the frequencies so it operates on both 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz, or you want to lock it to 2.4 or whatever you did, something we're going to be able to find in the log. And just explain what happened. This gets at that pilot intent, right? If you're flying around an NFL game and somebody shows up, usually an FBI agent shows up and says, hey, you know, this is a flight restricted zone, you're not allowed to fly here. 95% of the time, the answer is, oh, I'm sorry, I had no idea. Well, what if I can show you that the user clicked a button that said, I accept that I'm not allowed to fly here, right? That's pretty common. So with that in mind, again, this is a 30-minute talk on a topic that has so many different things in it. So I only covered the surface of what's actually feasible with these. And when you really dig in, especially if you have an interesting question that you're trying to solve, with some of the different formats of data that you might be able to find. And we didn't even really talk about using things outside of the flight logs, but you can pull other data off of the platform that aren't in the flight logs. And of course, if there's modifications or alterations, now we have code that somebody wrote, or we have different things that somebody has done to tweak or change an aircraft. We might have a signature like much of the other standard DFIR type work. But everything here brings us to a new lead that we could potentially follow up on. And that's really the goal, especially if I recovered just the aircraft. I really need to find that pilot. I want to talk to the pilot. I want to know who the pilot is. I want to figure out what was going on. And if we're successful in that, we might just be able to prevent whatever they were trying to do from happening again. So with that, here's some open source tools, and I'll drop these links in the Slack as well. There's not, like I said, there's not a lot of stuff out there for the decryption side of the house. There's some, but there's not a lot. But there is a lot of stuff for phone logs. There's also DATCON, which has been around for quite some time, which allows you to parse the flight log. It won't get all of the information in some cases, but it will do a pretty good job of getting you most of what you're looking for. And then those bottom two, those are more, if you're interested in the DJI hacking community, DJI Rev is a pretty vibrant community on that. There's a lot of interesting things that they talk about. They have a Slack channel. This is one of their websites with a lot of information on it. All right. And with that, do we have any questions?